I'm just going to start with some introductions. My name is Jackie Larson, and I'm the Social Justice Ministries Director here in the Western Territory, Western US Territory. And then we have some other TCPs, which are trafficking per person. What are TCPs?
Territorial
Trafficking
contact
territorial
people.
contact persons for trafficking. So we have Elise Dobney from the Central Territory. We have Sheena Evans from the USA South Territory and Ariel from the Eastern Territory. And then we also have some special guests with us this morning as well, this afternoon as well. We have Major Lisa Hall. Major Lisa is the area commander in the Palm Beach area in the Southern Territory. We also have Rachel Ostergaard, who is the program manager for the Stop It program in Chicago. And we have Major Aaron Kaufman, who is currently the Coos Bay Corps officer and was previously the manager for the Seeds of Hope program in Las Vegas. So it's great to have our special guests with us, and we're so excited to have you all here to share with us today. This will be recorded, and we will be able to share this on the sajustice.us website afterwards. So it will be available for you to watch again, to share, if you would like to. But we're going to just open our time in prayer this morning. So let's pray together. Father God, we just thank you for this opportunity where we can come together using technology from all over the US, from Canada, from around the world, Lord. I just thank you that we can share in this way. And I thank you for the amazing experience that we have on the panel today, for the opportunity to learn from them and to understand ways that we can respond in our communities to the human trafficking issues around us. We just thank you that you are here with us. We pray that you will speak to us, speak through us, and we just ask these things in your name. Amen. I'm going to hand over to Elise.
Great. We are so excited about this panel today. It's perfect timing given how much awareness has been raised in the recent few months, weeks around the issue. And so we wanted to make sure that we took the time to really engage in conversation about how we can learn from the field, learn from folks with lived experience, from lived experience experts, to make sure that we are safely and effectively engaging in anti-trafficking efforts throughout our communities. And so I think to get us started, I'm actually going to ask Major Aaron if you could just start setting the foundation for what we're talking about when we say human trafficking. I realize that many of us have been involved in these conversations, but we want to make sure that we are using the same definitions, have the same understanding. And so, Major Aaron, I'm going to hand it off to you to get us started.
Thanks, Elise. So I will go over, I made a little slideshow with the definitions, the U.S. code definitions for both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, because they both fall under the same for human trafficking. So I'm going to briefly talk about labor trafficking. And the working definition, the technical definition, is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So basically, labor trafficking, it occurs when individuals are lured, compelled, recruited for work, whether it's through farming, maid services, personal assistance, from anywhere in the exchange for money, rent, anything, with a promise for a better life. And the victims are rarely able to seek help because often their IDs are taken away. Again, the force, fraud, or coercion is used. If they leave, something will happen to their family. So labor trafficking is working in exchange for rent, food, anything, and then being stuck there. And the numbers are pretty staggering. Over 24.9 million people around the globe are in forced labor in 2016. The next area is sex trafficking, and it has the same basic definition with the force, fraud, or coercion. So I'll go ahead and read it. But sex trafficking is a recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So it's the kind of the newer definition that helps us understand it is the action means purpose, which means that human trafficking occurs when a perpetrator, often referred to as a trafficker, takes action. They induce, recruit, harbor, transport, or provide, and then employs by means of force, fraud, or coercion for a victim of commercial sex act. It's transporting them, it's advertising, it is, again, sex for exchange of drugs, rent, food, and being held against your will. You cannot get away, again, with threats of harming family, and then no IDs and no way to leave. So the next area I was just going to cover briefly is a few stats, and this presentation, we can send it out to you, but just to look at it, human trafficking has a revenue of 150 billion. These are combined, more than Google, Amazon, and Starbucks. It's a $99 billion worldwide for sex trafficking. And 49.6 million people were living in modern slavery in 2021. The numbers are staggering. These are people that are in places and they're stuck. It is heartbreaking. But so these are the definitions. These are some of the stats. The one that I've experienced and just draws me again and again to this work is that 90% of women in the sex industry say they wanted to escape but had no other means. So I'm sure this is why we do what we do and why we want to get the information out today.
Thank you so much, Major Aaron. I'm going to actually ask that Rachel take a few minutes. So we have our definitions. We understand what trafficking is. I think sometimes we can get a little lost in what it looks like concretely in our communities. And so I'm going to ask Rachel to just share for a few minutes about what forms of trafficking the Stop It program is seeing currently.
Yeah, hi everybody. I feel like I should say my name again, even though I've already been introduced twice. Hi, I'm Rachel from the Stop It program in the Chicago area. Yeah, when thinking about this and trying to figure out how to describe what trafficking looks like, it's kind of hard to know exactly where to go because folks who are survivors of trafficking come from so many different backgrounds and have so many vast lived experiences, and it looks really different from person to person and from situation to situation. But we'll try to break it down a little bit. Just in the context of our program, this year alone, we have about 50 cases open of intensive community-based case management, and about half of them, not entirely, about half of them are labor trafficking, half of them are sex trafficking. And I think that's kind of an important thing to think about because so much more of the media and so much more of the way trafficking is portrayed really highlights sex trafficking. It's so much more in the spotlight. And that's not actually what we see on the ground working in this field. And every year it's a little bit different. It's not always quite this clean of a split, but it's usually somewhere between 60-40 or 50-50. It's like we see a lot of labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking. And also the folks in our program come from, about half of them are US born and the rest come from countries all over the world. We've a fair amount from Venezuela and Mexico, Guatemala, Kenya, India, Pakistan. We've also over the years had clients from all over Europe as well. We've had some French, some folks from England, Poland. So I'll throw that out there just to kind of hopefully paint a little bit of a picture of like what folks' background is like. It really varies quite a bit. I also want to say just a couple things give a couple examples of like some of the labor trafficking cases that we've seen too. Like we've had cases through our program that one where an individual was trafficked by a landlord and forced to do a bunch of different jobs. He was forced to work and he worked at a restaurant, he worked at a couple different restaurants, he worked here, he worked there. I don't want to say any identifying information. But he worked at a couple of different places in the area. And the landlord, although he was able to come and go as he pleased, to come and go to work and whatever, he was forced to hand over those paychecks to the landlord. And the landlord used force and threats of force and violence in order to make him hand over those paychecks. And so that was one example that we see of labor trafficking. Also, another sort of common scenario is folks coming in to the US with the proper work visas. There's a bunch of ways that folks can get the quote unquote right visas to come into the country. And then once they're here, that the person who maybe sponsored them or helped them get the visa could be an individual, could be or it also could be a temp or an agent, like a larger company might exploit them, and their living conditions might be very different than what they thought. They might get their wages withheld. They may, in the case of one situation, the Chicago area, a woman sponsored, when the case was recovered, with the folks who recovered, there were 30 people living in the basement of this woman's house, and they were forced into working at a labor at a factory. Again, you know, people in the community might see see those people coming and going from the house they were living in, but they weren't able to leave the situation because they didn't know they didn't speak much English, they didn't know what their rights were, they didn't realize that what was happening to them was exploitation. And so those are some examples. As Elise knows, I can tend to talk and talk, so I will wrap it up there. I will also, well, I'll say one more thing. You know, we do have cases of sex trafficking as well. I know I just highlighted the labor trafficking because I feel like it's underrepresented in the discussions around human trafficking, but we do work with, like I said, about 50% of our cases currently are sex trafficking. And so sometimes that's like what's classically thought of as like a boyfriend who's exploiting someone, or we do see a fair amount of familial trafficking as well. So the initial point of trafficking or initial first trafficking situation is a family member, or sometimes a parent or an uncle or a cousin or whatever, and forced into some kind of commercial sex exchange. I will point out that another thing we see a lot in the media is this fear around kidnapping as the way trafficking happens. And I want to point out that that's really not something that we actually see very often. That's not a common point of entry for someone who's experiences sex trafficking. It's much more common for it to be through a relationship or someone that they know, a friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a parent, someone like that. And so, yes. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and mute myself.
Thanks, Rachel. So we know that sex trafficking is alive and thriving in our communities. Labor trafficking is very prolific as well. I wonder, Major Lisa, could you share a bit about how we could see the Salvation Army, our current ministries, programs, locations, maybe encountering folks who are experiencing exploitation and trafficking?
Yes, thank you. So, and I also want to acknowledge that there might be a few people from outside the Salvation Army on this webinar, and all of us in any kind of service provision may encounter human trafficking victims who just come into our offices. And if our staff members are trained, are well trained, they will know what questions to ask, what signs to look for. But they should also, all of our staffs, be equipped and have the community resources available at their fingertips so that they can help refer somebody to another organization that might be able to help one of the needs that they have. Likewise, here in Palm Beach County and really across the United States, the Salvation Army might receive referrals from an organization that's specifically working with human trafficking victims. And we have services such as rent and utilities and food and maybe furniture or other kinds of help that we could help those other agencies who are helping victims of human trafficking. So that's one way. Another way is through our shelters. Most Salvation Army units, especially in the larger cities, have shelters, and they may encounter human trafficking victims who come to us just in need of shelter because they recognize the name of the Salvation Army. And again, if our staff are trained, they'll be able to better serve the needs of human trafficking victims. On the flip side, shelters could be used to house human trafficking victims on purpose, not by accident, as long as they're provided a separate and a safe location of their own and they're not mixed with the other populations. I'll talk a little bit more in another section about how collaborations can work, maybe with a shelter and another organization. And then youth programs. The Salvation Army and many other organizations have youth programs, and that's a great way to provide prevention opportunities. There are age-appropriate curriculums that can be used to help prevent human trafficking through programs that we already do. We already have things like our regular youth programs, Boys and Girls Clubs, community centers, camps. The Salvation Army has community recommendations or curriculum recommendations, or your local human trafficking coalition might be able to provide recommendations for a curriculum that's age appropriate for various groups of young people. And that's all I have for right now. Thank you.
Actually, Major, I have a quick question for you. Those same programs that you talked through as potential referral sources, would you say that we also would see survivors engaging with services, maybe not being identified as such, but already seeking support, programming services through Salvation Army?
Absolutely. And often, just because of who we are, people will walk in our front door and, regardless of what type of Salvation Army facility it is, they see the sign, they may walk in the front door and be seeking, they don't even know what in times, they just are in a point of desperation. Maybe they just need somebody to talk to, some advice, but they also might need shelter, that sort of thing. But rarely do they identify as a victim of human trafficking. So that's where helping to train our staffs, I believe, would go a long way. And so they can recognize the signs and ask some leading questions that might lead them into finding out because if they're victims of human trafficking, often a lot more doors are open to them within our community, depending on what kinds of services your particular community offers. But I know if they are a certified human trafficking victim, that unlocks a lot of other services that they might not have otherwise.
Great, thank you. Before we dive into our next and primary part of the session, there actually was a question that I think is really important to understand as we're thinking through what it looks like to respond to trafficking. The question is, when the definitions were being expressed, we kept reading and hearing that trafficking is usually against a person's will. Is there any instance where a person goes willingly for the purposes of trying to help their families or the promise of that? And how would we decipher that? I'm wondering, maybe Rachel, is that something that you could speak to?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I saw that in there too. And I was like, ooh, when do we get to answer it? That's a great question. And I think it's an important distinction. There's an important distinction there too. I think a situation can become trafficking once someone is not able to leave that situation, right? If I decide that I want to get an H2, I'm Mexican and I come here on an H2 or H2B visa, because I want to provide for my family and I want to have a job and I want to work. But the moment my documents are taken, or I am no longer able to leave that situation, or I am getting threatened, or there's violence against me, that's when it becomes can transition into a trafficking situation. Similarly with sex trafficking, I can decide that I want to engage in sex work. Right? I can make that decision. I need to provide for my family. This is the way I want to do it. But if there ever becomes a point where there's another person who is not, then I can't decide to stop doing it anymore. Like if my boyfriend or my husband or my uncle is like, well, actually you have to keep engaging in this. And if you don't, A, B, and C are going to happen. That's when it turns from one sort of situation to another. So goes from something that might be bad and not good and maybe even exploitative and on some level, crossing the line into something that's actually hits that legal definition of human trafficking. Yeah. And I think that the only real way to decipher this is through conversation and relationship with someone. And there's no hard and fast way to really know. Also, in part because sometimes people may not really know what they're experiencing has crossed that line or not. And I've been working in anti-trafficking since a really long time, almost since 2005, so almost 20 years, which makes me feel real old. But like most people aren't using this language to talk about it anyway. They're not talking about their trafficking situation. They're not self-identifying in that way. Our drop-in center, people who call our hotline, people aren't usually opening with that, but using a bunch of other language to talk about their situation. So I think that the way to really decipher that and the way to really kind of figure that out is through conversation and getting to know people, and also just meeting the needs that they're presenting. And if I think about, and I'll stop talking after this last point, I promise. But I think about, like, if someone's coming into our space, like, what needs are they needing to get met, and are we meeting those needs? Do we need to know if they're a trafficking survivor? Probably not, right? Maybe, and there might be extra support and services, and certainly there are protections if they are, but do we need to know that, or are we able to provide them with whatever needs they're needing to get met, without knowing whether or not for sure they're a victim of human trafficking?
If I can just add one thing, the same is also true for, with the sex industry. Someone may go to the strip clubs to work to support their family. They're going there voluntarily, but then the force, fraud, coercion comes in, where in order to do this, you've got to also work in the VIP room, or you've got to do these other things. So that's when the human trafficking, and now they're there against their will. I just wanted to add that piece.
Yeah. So clearly initial consent is almost irrelevant, right? In that, it doesn't matter if you initially agreed to a situation. If you want to leave and you are not able to leave because you are being forced, tricked, or threatened, it absolutely is trafficking, whether or not they initially chose the situation, right? Thank you so much for all of those perspectives. If we could hear from you, your various roles, what are the ways in which people could get involved? They have heard about trafficking, there was a recent case in their community, whatever the case may be, how their awareness has been raised. What are ways in which people could connect? And if you could do like a brief little, it doesn't even have to be explanation, not that long, but little, this is the perspective that I'm coming from as a direct service provider or as X, Y, and Z. That would be helpful in understanding ways in which people can get involved with the different locations, different programs. Anyone want to go first? Go ahead, Major. Oh, Major Aaron, I saw you unmute, so I'm just gonna.
I was tasked to share about the core. I mean, there's many different ways, and I think Major Lisa shared about this, training staff. I see there's some folks on from Colorado Springs, and we had someone come in through our food pantry. So just having the staff trained, knowing, someone's coming in, they don't have IDs, they keep going out to their car to talk to someone to get information. I think education is great for staff. As far as practical things to do, I still believe that visiting strip clubs and bringing gifts, whether it's for Mother's Day, Christmas, and bringing, I think we had something in the West called Sweet. I can't remember the name, but we would bring things into the strip club. That's always a good idea to begin relationship. Sweet prayers, thanks during, making gifts for folks, getting involved in local groups, volunteering at whether it's a rape crisis center, refuge for women, getting involved with Cupcake Girls. There's many areas in the core. I think another one of the biggest one is the prevention end, working with our youth and our women, making sure they're seen and heard and valued, so that we have relationships with them. It may reveal that there may be some situations in their own home. So I just think it's being present, being in relationship with your core members, with your community, being active in any of the women's shelters or programs in town. And that could be your women's group, it could be your community care ministries, and just education, arming people with education and information, I think is important.
Thank you, Major Aaron. Rachel, could you talk a little bit for folks who are looking to do something to address trafficking?
Yeah, I'd say, I can't have a straight answer for everyone because it really depends on what's happening in your communities, right? Like what's on the ground. I will say, so I will speak to what's helpful for us in our community. I think some of the things Major Aaron touched on, I think are important, like finding out, getting involved in um, kind of volunteer. Totally lost my train of thought in the middle of that. Getting informed and being aware of like what's happening in your communities is a really important piece of that. And like training of folks at cores and food pantries, all of it I think is really important. For us as a program, like find out, I would suggest for all of you guys to find out what anti-trafficking programs are doing in the community and find out what they need specifically. Like we have a very much a big need for volunteers at the Stop It program. And we have our volunteers help us run our hotline, and they help us staff our drop-in space. And there's some training, there's some vetting, there's some hoops you got to jump through in order to do that. But that's one way that you can potentially get involved, find out what's going on in your community. I will also say that find out if there are things, there's all donation needs. I feel like we as a program are always in need of some stuff. Often we have a clothing closet and people can donate clothes, but also like right now we have a handful of folks who are starting ESL classes at the local community college, and we need laptops. We need computers for folks because it's really hard to do any schooling without a computer. And you can say, well, yeah, go to the library, but libraries aren't open all the time and all that stuff. So like see what other tangible things a program might need and start from there. I would also say the education, as I sort of mentioned, and awareness is important, but I would also say really like dig in and do your research. There's a lot of information out there about trafficking, and like some of it is solid and some of it is not. So I would really say like dig in and do your research if you really are serious about wanting to become more aware and know what it really looks like and what it really looks like in your communities. I mean, and I'd be happy to send you some resources too. Like, so I would say that's another thing, just like do your due diligence to read about what's happening in your communities. And that's all for now.
Major Lisa, feel free to jump in with some more opportunities for folks.
Okay, I echo everything that both of them said. Most communities have some type of a public task force or coalition, human trafficking. If you just Google it in your own area, chances are that there are anti-trafficking groups already formed. And if you have something like a coalition, that is made up of multiple groups that come together. So attending one of those meetings, like I said, most of them have public offerings. So go to those meetings, and then you network with other people and see who's doing what in the community. As a Salvation Army officer, I've moved from city to city, state to state, and that's one of the first things that I do is find out, is there a coalition or a task force that's open to the public here? And I go to those meetings so that I can see who's doing what and where can the Salvation Army fit in. It's great because it's a chance to collaborate with other people. And when you go to those coalition meetings, to the point that the other two made, they offer volunteer opportunities, either joining with a strip club team or passing out little chapsticks or QR codes or something with the hotline number in at-risk or high-risk public restrooms like truck stops or in neighborhoods where they have gas stations that that there's some kind of trafficking going on there, or even clinics or hospitals, to work with them to see if you can put something in their restrooms, because a lot of the particularly sex trafficking victims might present themselves at a clinic or an urgent care or a hospital ER room. And so if you have something like that in the public restroom, they have a resource that they can tuck into their purse or something. Or you could even become a trained speaker. Our local Human Trafficking Coalition of the Palm Beaches provides trainings to all the middle schools and high schools in our county. We come in at their invitation, but we could be working with a class of 20 or 30 people, or the whole grade of 1,000 kids in the cafeteria at one time, which I just did a few days ago. And they're always looking for more trained speakers. But also they go into like school public safety events and things like that, where there are multiple organizations that have a table and they set up a table. And so you could even volunteer to do that without having to be trained. The other thing that I wanted to mention is collaboration um, between organizations. I think it's key to tackling this evil in our society, whether it's awareness events or trainings or providing services. When we work with other organizations, I think it's just vital to the success of all of our efforts. No one agency can do anything alone. No one person can do anything alone. In Palm Beach County, we partner with Catholic Charities to provide services. So we provide a safe house, and Catholic Charities provides all the wraparound services for the victims, survivors that are housed in our safe house. When organizations, churches, governments, law enforcement, providers, individuals all come together, the sum is so much greater than the parts. And we can get so much more accomplished. And I want to close with a recent success story in a recent case. Just weeks ago, there was a victim in our county that had escaped from another state from her trafficker. The FBI had been trying to find her. They finally, through their resources, found her living in our county, contacted our local FBI victim services office, who then contacted some of the service providers that she knew worked with human trafficking victims, including the Salvation Army. And within just a couple of hours, the victim had a hotel, food, gift cards, clothing, diapers for the baby, and then within a few days, transportation, all provided by a group effort to get her back to her home state where she had so many more resources open to her. So that is a success story by any measurement. And that's what all of us can do together, coming together, but starting by just plugging in to whatever's happening in your community. And
I just
that's
want
all.
to jump and say one other thing real quick is like echoing what has been said, but also like, and I even am someone who's like, yes, we have these volunteer opportunities to be on our hotline and to do this and that, but also like really follow the lead of what people are saying they are needing in terms of assistance around this. I feel like over the years, we've had some people who are just like so eager to chomp at the bit of like, I want to work with survivors of trafficking with this sort of like eagerness, like they in a way that can feel voyeuristic. And I say that, and I'm working in anti-trafficking. I want to work with survivors of anti-trafficking, so I can't like I get it, but at the same time, like just really be aware and responsive to what whoever you're like we're reaching out to says that they actually need or not. And if they're like, you know what, like we're not taking anybody to help do any direct care at this time, but here's some things you can do, that would be like just really like take that into account. I know that's happened with us a couple of times, and it's like, and then when those opportunities will come back around, that we will make sure people know about them. But I just wanted to point that because we realize that people are like really really eager, and I understand that and I get that. At the same time, really it's important to follow the lead of whoever is the person with the most direct content, the organization, the coalition, the whoever. And also something that Major Lisa, you said, you mentioned the hospital signs. Another thing I would encourage y'all to do is to see like what are the rules and laws in your communities about what signage needs to be out there, and like where can we, that's like in hospitals will certainly have some mandates, at least in some places, right? And so I would look into that and see if that's not something that is being done. How can you help make that get done? And about signage, I will also say, like, I don't think it's very effective to have the sign just say, are you a victim of human trafficking or know somebody who is? Because people are gonna be like, what? Like, people don't self-identify that way. So breaking it down in like, are you in a work situation where you can't leave, or are you being forced to trade sex for something of value? Like break it down. The language of human trafficking is really helpful for us, and as service providers, it helps us in the legal realm, but it's still not the parlance of the people who are actually experiencing this for the most part. So
And Jackie, the Blue campaign, you can get free supplies, unlimited free supplies. If just Google the Blue campaign from the federal government, and they have little cards and stickers and things that you can get in bundles, and they ask those questions. And one of the things, to your point, absolutely, you need to ask before you put things in the public restrooms and things, especially like something big like a hospital. But like our coalition does trainings for hotels, hospitals, clinics, and even law enforcement, because even people in law enforcement, it's much better now than it was 20 years ago. But to help law enforcement know how to look for the signs. But when our coalition does trainings in those situations, they have a connection with that hospital or the clinic or whatever. And so usually we're actually invited in to come in and bring those kind of materials and leave them, in the lobby, in the waiting area, whatever. The state of Florida has done a really good job of promoting awareness in our airports and all of that. So yeah, but definitely I would ask for permission.
And to be clear, I was in support of the signs too.
Yes, yes, yes.
I wasn't like, oh no, don't put, so.
Someone actually brought up, so great opportunities, great ideas for kind of some initial steps. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on males or male identified folks who are interested in getting involved? Sometimes they can experience some pushback or hesitancy. So what does that look like for males who feel really strongly that they need to be doing more to address trafficking?
We have some men in our coalition, in our human trafficking coalition, and they have served as trainers. They have served at some of those, what we call tabling events, where there's like a safety fair or something. And that's a great way for them to get involved without having direct contact with victims, which, as we've all said, that could be discouraged anyway. We do have a lot of, and we didn't talk much about that, but there are men victims of both labor and sex trafficking. And when we opened our safe house, actually the very first victim that was sent to us was a male sex trafficking victim. So it does happen for young people, old people, men and women, and transgender.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Nate. And it does bring up some like complications potentially, because understandably, like if female identified folks might not feel, and this is something we've come up with on our hotline, about in terms of having male volunteers, like, and we've heard from our female identified folks that like they feel uncomfortable when it's a man who answers, right? So there are some limitations there. However, as Major Lisa said, there are men who are involved in trafficking, survivors of labor and sex trafficking. So I would reach out to kind of whatever, this is like maybe not now because it's like reach out to whoever is in your community, but for real, because I know there might be opportunities. And I think having for male survivors, it might be really helpful to have someone that they can talk to have that sort of like connection with someone from an organization who is also male identified. Also, I think there's definitely a space for in the prevention education piece. Great opportunity for men to go talk about labor trafficking, sex trafficking, about this situation. It is in part because it does often so skew female in how people perceive it at the very least. And so having more guys involved, I think could be helpful on a number of different levels for people to see it as not just a women's issue, but as a person's issue. And also for the general public to see that, and then also for survivors themselves to like see like, oh, it's not just women talking about this, but also men.
I would also think that we don't have a lot of conversations, at least I'm thinking very local Salvation Army context, around purchasing sex, around the kind of demand side. And full transparency, a group of like males are probably not going to want to hear about me about why that could be really harmful, right? Because I am a female who doesn't, it's just different, right? And so I think that's another side of awareness, prevention, kind of shifting the narrative around the commercial sex industry, that I can't play, that it would be really helpful to have male voices. So I think there's a lot of potential for that as well. Anything else before we move on to the next question? Okay, feel free to throw in other questions in the Q&A, but while you think about that, I do want to there's a question, this is really important, especially for faith-based organizations, whether it's a church or an organization that is faith-based. So us in the Salvation Army should absolutely be keeping this in mind and be really intentional. So the question is, trafficked persons have been controlled and told how to dress, what to eat, where to live, where to sleep, where to go, etc. How can we make sure that when someone comes to any of our our programs, our locations, they're not told what to believe in order to receive services? And I want to just add a little bit to that of making sure that faith doesn't make people feel unsafe in that. If that, I guess I shouldn't have added. It sounds good as it is. So how do we make sure people are not told what to believe in order to receive services?
I'll go ahead and start with that because I think for all of our programs, we really need to focus on the trauma-informed care piece. And I know it has been practiced in the Salvation Army that our programs are one size fits all. And I know we're slowly moving away from that and treating the client as an individual and not having no judgment, no on anything that they're going through or what they've done or what they're doing or what they're going to do. I just think it's very important that, we live out what our mission says without discrimination and having them come in. The most recent study for residential programs, especially for youth, is that the role-based structured programs does mimic some of the patterns of their situations before. And just allowing someone to eat cereal at 3 a.m. is a freedom that someone hasn't had for years. So I just think we need to be very careful on what our program looks like and making it client-centered, trauma-informed, and just looking at our programs with new eyes and new vision, and being accepting and open to what is best for that person.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that Salvation Army units and all social services, especially faith-based ones, are sensitive to the fact that you don't have to come to church in order to eat. You don't have to sit through a Bible study to get the shelter night or something. But we offer that as a benefit. We have chaplains in most of our residential programs. I know we do here in Palm Beach County. We have a chaplain that's great, and those are offered. Those options, faith options, are offered to all of our residents in our various programs, but nothing is mandatory. And I agree with what Major Kaufman said about we have to look at if it's a full program for human trafficking. I'm not talking about if you just encounter somebody, but it's actually a human trafficking program that you're running. You do have to be very sensitive to, and I invite Rachel to speak into that because that's what she does. But that they need some freedoms to be able to make some decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I will also this also brings to mind like the fact that I've worked with a lot of folks over the years, right? And there's more than you would maybe imagine that have experienced spiritual abuse as one of the coercive tactics. Their trafficker, I can think of offhand of one situation where the trafficker was the bishop of their church. This is a sex trafficking case. Was the bishop of their church. Another one where it was a cultish sort of extreme situation, but mom was the initial trafficker and was very explicitly like, God will hate you and kill you if you tell anybody that this is happening, right? And so that's very powerful, particularly for a young person. And also there's a case that was, I don't, for whatever reason, it was tried in our territory, but it was out of Philadelphia and up in the East Coast area. This woman her name is Bishop Tracy Dickey. You can look her up. She was self-proclaimed bishop of her own self-proclaimed church. And she was forcing people to work and taking their money, and it was and pilfering people from they were working at a hotel and setting people up through a fake travel agency and taking all the money and using her role as a spiritual advisor and as a bishop of the church, as a faith leader, using that to coerce, to traffic people, right? And so I think we do have to be very careful when we are addressing anything with faith or spirituality, because we don't know what that background is. And maybe that has been something that has been a tool that's been used against someone in the past. And I know we as a program, I mean, we're a Salvation Army program, so but we're mostly federally funded. So we have very sort of clear restrictions about how we can talk about anything faith or spiritual based. But we do also have options to get people connected to pastoral care, right? So we offer that. And sometimes people take us up on that. And that's a great resource for folks who are interested. But we're very careful and very sort of intense about that, because we know how that can be such a powerful control tool if used poorly, right? And so yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious if you could speak, and I don't know, maybe Rachel and Major Aaron, this might be specific, directed more to you, but when thinking about survivors, folks with lived experiences who were seeking support, what kinds of supports were being requested, sought after? Was it help in exiting the situation? What did that look like?
I'll start. I'm sure Rachel will add to what I share. I mean, basically, all helps. I mean, it's getting out of the situation. It's shelter. It's food. It's clothing. But once they get in the program, it's a lot of counseling help, education, going back to school, getting identifications, dealing with legal issues. There are a lot of helps because someone's starting out from scratch, and resume writing. How do you fill in 7 years? So there's just a lot of help that they come to us needing, and we have the privilege of providing those helps. Housing is the biggest one, I think, across the board. And I would encourage anyone in the Salvation Army that has transitional housing or any housing, set aside a couple units specifically for trafficking victims for aftercare. I think there's only 450 beds in the whole country. And we have a wonderful opportunity in the Salvation Army just to provide a couple units in each location that has transitional housing.
Yes, there's lots of needs, as Major Aaron said, and I would say for sure housing, it tends to be the one that we come across the most. It is also the most difficult to get. We need emergency housing, we need transitional housing, we need long-term housing, we need supports, we need a lots of things, right? So in terms of some of the primary needs, that's kind of what we see the most, but also all the things that kind of come around that. I mean, most of the folks that we work with have exited their trafficking situation. There's not that many situations where we are actively helping somebody get out or needing to get law enforcement or anyone else to get in and like help extricate themselves from situations. Most of the time, I mean, I tell you what, survivors of human trafficking are some of the smartest, most resilient, most use the most ingenuity. I'll say ingenuitous, but I don't think that's a word. Like some of the stories I've heard from the folks I've worked with over the years, I'm just like, that's so freaking brilliant. How did you figure out how to survive through all of this in so many creative and strong and amazing ways? So most of the folks that we work with have already gotten out of their situation, and they just need to are just wanting to figure out what next, right? And so that's why housing is really important, because sometimes we might see that someone might willingly go back to a situation that may not be trafficking, but might make them increase their vulnerability to be trafficked again if there isn't a safe place for them to go and stay. I would say so housing is a big one, but also like access to resources for education and employment, access to childcare. Like I can't tell you how many clients in our program right now are not working because there is no affordable childcare options. They would like to work, but like if you have 3 kids, and the 5 and under, who can afford to put 3 kids in daycare? I have a full-time job and so does my partner, and I can barely afford to have my kids in care, right? So I think that's another thing that's really important. And then also just like they need all of the things to survive that we all do, then I also wanted to highlight the mental health support. There are not enough trauma informed and therapists out there and folks who really know and understand the ins and outs of human trafficking and are willing and are able to take clients that have no money, right? It's just something that it's one of the biggest issues we have in our community here is people want long-term therapeutic or trauma counseling, trauma therapy, and there just aren't a lot of options. The options that are there are through organizations and stuff, which are fine, but they are maybe can have like 6 to 12 sessions, which is not enough if you are coming from 10 years of complex trauma. So
I'd like to add, in our community, there's a fairly new group that has formed called Sharing One Love, and I think they have some pockets around the country. It's a group of faith-based organizations, churches, individuals, all coming together to help meet the needs of trafficking victims in that community. And we'll have 3-hour long meetings where we just sit around the table and we're talking about what do you do, but then what are your needs and what are you seeing? And one of the needs that has come out of that group was that the fact that a lot of survivors, they may have been through a program or multiple programs. Now they're ready to find permanent housing or semi-permanent housing, but because of their record, nobody, including not only their law enforcement record, but also possibly their credit background, that sort of thing. Nobody's willing to rent to them. So, and maybe they're making, they have a job now, but because of that record and that background check that's done on them. So one of the local commercial realtors, she does commercial and residential realty. She joined this group and she's trying to assemble a list of landlords that are willing to work with people that have background check issues, particularly trafficking. So those kind of very practical things. And again, it comes about by collaboration and just showing up and talking together, trying to work on the issues, as a whole community.
Thank you all for those thoughts and ideas. Hopefully hearing the needs that people are presenting with gives us some ideas on ways that we could get involved, resources that we could offer, whether it's people we know or resources that our programs have, that our core have. I think that's really important for us to know what we have to offer before we start to, or maybe now, even if we're in the midst of providing support, right? I think the anti-trafficking community, whoever's involved, is stretched really thin. And so to have conversations on and on about, well, here are different opportunities for you to get involved can be more than folks have the capacity to do, right? But if we can say, we as the Salvation Army, we as this location have these basic, even if it's basic services, these are the 2 things, these are the 4 things that we can offer. If anyone has these needs, it's a great place to start. I think that's really important for us to know what we have to offer. From a humble perspective of, we just want to walk alongside folks who are doing the work, folks with lived experiences, and do our part to help. Thank you so much.
I want to say one other thing, piggyback off that, Elise. I mean, I get this a lot, and people are like, oh, wanting to become social workers or do this direct care. But like the truth is, like, not everyone's cut out for that, and not everyone's interested in that. And that's great and fine. But because we really need people in all sectors of society who understand what's going on and are willing and able to do something with that. And I think there's one initiative called FAST, financial something, I don't know what it stands for, but it's this large, it'll come to me in a minute probably, but it's basically an initiative to provide financial support and services through lower access or lower barriers to having bank accounts for survivors, right? So that's someone in the banking industry, in the finance industry, is like, this is an issue, human trafficking is an issue, and I am a banker, and this is something I can do. And so that's been hugely important. We've gotten a lot of people access to bank accounts, which they can start saving money. Maybe they can eventually start working on building their backup, their credit backup, things like that. And I think that's something that people think about trafficking and they think about the direct care, which is also really important, right? Like and that's the space I'm in. But no matter kind of what your venue is or what your career is or what your gifts are, there is a space to get involved in this work and in a meaningful way, right? So I just wanted to like echo what Elise was saying with that, because it's not just like the direct care piece, but rather we need folks who are involved on all levels and all parts of society. Like we need people who are willing to rent apartments to people who don't have a credit score, right? Because that's all of our people. We need to get them housed, and that's a barrier. So if you're someone who has some units in an apartment, like think about that. Thinking about making those available. And that's all for now.
Any final, as we're coming to a close, any final thoughts, things that any of the panelists want to say, share? Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us today. Oh, go ahead, Major Lisa.
I was just going to thank the participants. Just by joining this webinar, you're showing that you've got a great interest, and I hope that you do reach out to somebody in your local community to get involved and find ways to put what is it, feet to faith. So thank you all.
If I can just
And if
add
you're
one
looking,
thing.
oh yeah,
Oh,
yep, absolutely.
It's just helpful, is the hotline number, just because we can call and ask questions. It doesn't have to be to report a human trafficking issue, but they're a great resource if there's questions. And it's the numbers, it's 888-3737-888. So just having that resource handy and available, so that if any of you have a question, just call it. And it, again, 888-3737-888. And if you have questions, you don't know what to do, you can call them anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a great resource.
Absolutely. And feel free, I know earlier in the chat, the email addresses for the TCPs for all 4 USA territories are there. If you email the wrong person, it's okay. We're happy to provide help and connection as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you need some guidance on how to get more involved, get connected to folks doing the work in your communities. Just a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be posted on the sajustice.us website. Give us a few days to get it up there, but it will be available. And we will, I don't remember, Jackie, how we disseminate the link, but it will be available. Thank you all for your time and for joining us this morning, this afternoon. We look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Take care.